certainly hope you enjoyed that segment with Blanca. She's a very colorful character, and she spent a lot of her life in government. And I'll tell you, she's also very involved in the local community activities here in Aspen. It's one of the things we talked about on this show, just the need to get involved, to get active. If getting involved in politics is not your thing, get involved in your local community. And sometimes you'll see that there's a spillover, because oftentimes local community involvement will be touched by government somewhere along the line. And that we've been encouraging the need to get involved. And you can't come away from an interview with Blanca without understanding me fascinated with how dedicated she's been and how involved she's been, particularly in the political world. As we mentioned at the start of the show, perhaps the most apparent area of dysfunction, at least in government these days, revolves around our budgeting and our federal deficit. So what we want to talk about today is maybe a little bit of a educational segment on what it's about to pass a budget, and then in the next show we're going to talk about the deficit. But I don't think many people understand the budgeting process, and in particular what it means when we don't have a budget, because we haven't had a budget for most of the past over 3 years in this country. Well, the budgeting in this sense is no different than the budgeting that all of us do with our families. Every day and every year, at some point, we sit down and we say, here's how much is coming in, which means that's how much we have to spend. And then the question is, how much are we going to spend it on? Now, some families I know do it to the penny, and they do it either weekly or monthly. Some families maybe an annual budget, and some families don't have a budget. And I think you'll find the families that don't have a budget are the ones that wake up one day and find out that they've got serious financial problems. I'm a big believer in budgets, because if nothing else, you need to know where you stand for your family, and in this case for your country, in terms of the amount coming in and the amount going out. So in theory, every year the federal government is supposed to have a budget, and that started last October 1 again, and it runs through this September. And we actually do have a budget now in the federal government. It was passed just last month. But we haven't had a budget here for many years. The process for a budget starts with the president. The president is charged with introducing a budget to Congress, and the president usually delivers his budget sometime around the first week of February. Now, this is the president's vision for what the budget should be. And the president doesn't make the laws, however. It's incumbent upon Congress to actually pass a law which includes the budget. And budget laws are called appropriations. Appropriations meaning the spending of money. So the president has made a suggestion at the beginning of February, and it's now up to Congress to decide how they want to take the president's suggestion, move things around, and ultimately come up with legislation. So the first thing they normally do in Congress are pass what they call budget resolutions. These are usually passed sometime in the spring, and they usually dictate kind of a limit that is going to be spent in the budget. Not totally dissimilar to what we talked about with the family, where you consider what all your resources are, so you know what you have to spend. Since the federal government is actually allowed to borrow money, they're not limited strictly by what they take in, but they do try to set and pass resolutions in the spring of each year to at least set the framework for the budget talks. Now, in most years, the Senate and the House will have their own version of what this number should be, and they often come together and reconcile that, and then they have a joint resolution which will set a number. Again, I don't think we've had a joint resolution in this country up until very recently, at least for most of the last 3 or 4 years, because we haven't agreed on almost anything. That's the dysfunctional part of all this. The next step for Congress would then be to have its various budgeting committees, its various appropriation committees, come up with a structure for their spending allocation. So there's a subcommittee that deals with education issues, transportation issues, and they're charged with coming up with a budget for their allocation of the spending and then what they're going to spend the money on. All of these committees report their bills back to the full Congress, and then the House will pass a budget usually, and the Senate will pass a budget. Or it could be that the House will pass a budget over to the Senate, and they may tweak it and send it back. There's a couple different ways this could happen. But hopefully at the end of the day, and hopefully certainly before October 1, which is the start of the fiscal year, Congress will have passed a budget. Now again, we haven't had a budget pass in this country for over almost 4 years until very recently. So what happens when there's no budget? What happens when you wake up on October 1 and no budget has been passed? Well, something has to happen, because if there is no law, then there's no spending authority. And that's when you hear these government shutdown discussions. Government will shut down if there's no spending authority. If you can't spend money, people can't be paid. If you can't spend money, you can't pay your debt sometimes. So Without these laws being passed, the government will shut down, and we have seen government shutdowns. Again, another example of the dysfunction in the system. But what they have done in the absence of budgets is pass what's known as continuing resolutions. And a continuing resolution just has the effect of saying, you know what we did last year, we'll just keep doing that because we can't figure out what to do in the alternative. It's kind of a cop-out, but at least it keeps the doors open, it keeps the trains running, it keeps the lights on. Continuing resolutions. But again, they are basically just saying we'll keep spending the way we have. It doesn't reflect the members of Congress doing the job they were hired to do and actually make some hard decisions about the fact that there's not enough money for what they want to spend it on, and where's this money going to go? That's what should be resolved through the Appropriations Committee process and ultimately the passing of the budget. So we now have the construct for how budget should be passed. We have the timing for how it should be passed, and you have the notion that they can pass a continuing resolution just to keep the doors open and the lights on. In the United States right now, each year, our budget has been in the range of $3.5 to $4 trillion. It's a big number. But also each year, we are spending considerably more than is being produced in revenues. Now, the bulk of the revenues that come in are taxes and fees and other items of that sort. So in most years, we are taking in X, but we're spending Y. And the Y has been significantly greater than X in most years. And that's where we come to the part where I mentioned before. The federal government has the authority to go borrow money to make up that gap. And it's that gap that, as it builds over time, that creates the federal deficit that you've heard about. So today we talked about the process for the budget. Next time we're going to talk about the process for the deficit, and both in the context of the fact that the polarization that we have in Congress is keeping us from having the compromise we need on these aspects, and that's creating the dysfunction.